some of the tables that are on the sample exam. So bring questions if you've been going through the study objectives or the sample questions. Bring them to class tomorrow. And that's kind of not a formal lecture review, but kind of try to tie this material in if there's questions and stuff that you have. So I'm going to lecture for about an hour, and then we'll do case studies. I think we have two. Death by poison. Anybody doing the ischemia one? The headache one? Okay. All right. So.
Death by poison.
Did you guys get Gretchen's YouTube address up here? She's been recording the videos of lecture. So if you want access to listen to videos, I don't know why you would want to go through it again, but
it helps.
It helps. You hear things that you don't.
Yeah, if you just go to YouTube and look up your name and bio, you get all of them.
You get all of them?
From last year.
Just can't get enough of you, Professor. I'm always watching them.
I just want to erase it out of my way up here.
I'm like, look, check out my professor. She's funny.
I haven't told my parents or any of my relatives it's up there. So another term for blood pressure is hydrostatic pressure. What we're talking about is the force of the blood pushing against the vessel wall. Now, if the vessel walls are expansive, all right, then that is going to decrease the force because it's going to stretch out with that. If they are hardened because of arteriosclerosis or fatty plaques, they're not going to stretch as easily, and so that's going to increase the pressure. So we're going to look at factors. There are two major components of blood pressure. Then we're going to look at cardiac output, which was the lecture that we missed last week, and peripheral resistance. Okay. Now this diagram shows kind of the overall average of blood pressure throughout the body. And you'll notice what we've been talking about all along is that the pressure is always decreasing. So as we move from, was that your fan? Did you want that there? I just couldn't see people. So as we move from the heart back to the heart, pressure is consistently dropping. If it didn't do that, we would have an interruption in blood flow. All right, so pressure goes, blood flows from a high pressure to a low pressure. We've talked about that with cardiac cycle. Also, proximal to the capillaries, we see a pulse. So we see an increase and decrease in pressure with each stroke volume. As the blood pumps in 70 mils into the aorta and that passes through the vessels, they stretch and recoil behind it, and that's what we feel as a pulse. Once we're within the capillaries and past the capillaries, there is no pulse. That does not mean there is no pressure. All right? There's obviously a pressure because there's blood flow there, but it's not a pattern of expanding and relaxation. That's proximal to the capillaries, closest to the heart that we see that. So we talked about the term systole and diastole, all right, with the heart in contraction. So our highest pressure average is 120, lowest pressure average is 80. Now we're not doing the blood pressure lab. The PhysioX extra credit lab you may still do, and that's due on Tuesday instead of tomorrow. All right? You should stay up till 2 to finish it, and then you can turn it in tomorrow. And mean pressure is, notice the mean arterial pressure here, MAP, is not the average between the two. Mean arterial pressure, if it was the average, would be 100. We take 120 plus 80 and divide by 2. Right, but that's, you'll notice that this mean arterial pressure line is closer to diastolic pressure. The reason for that is because if we look at our cardiac cycle and we look at our ECG, let's speak right out. We see here's the heart in systole. Obviously, I can make this as whatever period I want to, but the heart is at rest for a longer period of time than it is in systole. So our average, if it was contracting and relaxing and contracting and relaxing, then yes, our average blood pressure would be right in the middle. But because the heart is in diastole for a longer period of time, the average pressure is closer to diastolic pressure. So that's why this line is below the halfway mark. So let's look at the factors then that are going to affect blood pressure. Cardiac output and peripheral resistance. Okay? Our discussion on cardiac output will be, hopefully, a review. Peripheral resistance is measured by, is affected by three things. We'll get to in a few minutes, towards the end of lecture. Diameter, length, and the thickness or viscosity of blood. Okay?
Which doesn't change very often.
Viscosity can change. Length is really difficult. We don't go around cutting off a limb because our blood pressure is too high.
Gaining a lot of weight.
But gaining weight and losing weight will affect it. So cardiac output is the volume, it's minute volume. We'll look at this for minute volume for respiration, but for cardiac output, it's equal to your heart rate, which is beats or strokes per minute. Okay, and then stroke volume, which is the volume of one ventricular ejection. So this is not the sum of right and left ventricles, but it's one or the other. Does it matter which one?
Good with stroke volume?
They have to equal.
They should be equal, remember? So unless you're in congestive heart failure or one side is weaker than the other, the volume of the left side should be equal to the volume of the right side. Pressure is different, but stroke volume should be the same. So if we have an average heart rate of 70 beats per minute, average stroke volume is considered to be 70. A lot of people, books will put 72, but the math is easier to leave it at 70. So that gives us an average stroke volume of 4,900 mils, or almost 5 liters. We talked about this a little while ago. This is why an athlete can have a slower heart rate, because with a stronger heart, they can pump a greater volume with each stroke volume. So if instead of 70, they're pumping 100 mils, they can get the 5 liters with only 50 beats per minute. Okay. Now let's say that you have an ulcer or a bleed, or maybe you're just dehydrated. Okay, you have less volume of fluid in your body. So let's drop the stroke volume down to 50, and you can see what happens to heart rate to maintain the same cardiac output. So again, assign someone who's fainted, somebody who's been in an automobile accident maybe and has lost blood. You take their pulse. It's not described as a strong rapid pulse, a pounding pulse of 120 beats per minute. It's usually described as a weak, steady pulse. So it's very difficult to find and very rapid. And that's because there's not as much blood returning to the heart, and the heart's trying to keep the same stroke total cardiac output to maintain adequate blood pressure for perfusion. And so it's speeding up its heart rate. So we've already talked about what regulates heart rate. Let's do a review of that, and then we'll look at stroke volume. So heart rate is going to be our autorhythmic cells. Stroke volume is going to be affected by changes in the contractile cells. So autonomic nervous system. Parasympathetic is the vagus nerve. This is review, I know. Coming from the brainstem, from the medulla. And parasympathetic primarily goes to the sinoatrial node and to the atrioventricular nodes, to our autorhythmic cells. So it can affect heart rate. It does not go to the ventricular contractile cells, so parasympathetic is not going to affect stroke volume, okay, directly. It will affect heart rate. So this is, well, sorry, we haven't seen the cadavers yet. When I showed this, did this lecture this morning, we'd already seen the cadavers. So, superior vena cava vein, you'll have the opportunity to see how thin that is in comparison to the aorta. The yellow is the biggest nerve. So just a summary of what we covered a week or so ago. Acetylcholine binds to its receptor, which remember that's not a ligand-gated channel. It's a G protein regulated channel. And there are two different types of G proteins that can be affected. So the inhibitory G protein is going to inhibit adenylate cyclase. You're right, it's up there, but I'll slow myself down here, write it on the board. Because there is an overlap and a difference with sympathetic. So acetylcholine affecting inhibitory G proteins decreases the activity of adenylate cyclase. With decreased adenylate cyclase activity, we have a decrease in cyclic AMP. And with the decrease of cyclic AMP, doesn't show it on here, but the funny channels open later. Remember we talked about this? So if I were to diagram, so when the funny channels require hyperpolarization to open, so our potassium levels have to leave, and when they reach this level, all right, then the funny channels open, and sodium starts to enter the cell for depolarization. Under influence of acetylcholine, with less cyclic AMP, it becomes more negative before sufficient funny channels open and we start depolarization. Okay? So that's one effect, and fewer transient calcium channels open. Both of those are affected by cyclic AMP. So we go lower. And then the second effect is the stimulatory G proteins, typically the beta and gamma components of the G protein, not the alpha. Let me write this over here. Result in the opening of potassium channels. As you can see on the right, that results in an efflux or a loss of positive ions from the cell. And so from those two events having to go more negative and fewer transient loss of potassium, we have a more shallow gradient. So you can see that it takes longer. We don't start as soon, plus it takes longer to get to, draw a straighter line here, to get to the point at which we reach our action potential. So it takes longer to get to threshold. So that results in a slower heart rate. Okay. Hopefully that's starting to sound a little bit more familiar. In the very first day we talked about funny channels. We see the opposite effect now with norepinephrine. So that's the effect of parasympathetic. So if your heart rate, let's say blood pressure is elevated, and your body is trying to lower your blood pressure, this is what's going to happen. Now tomorrow we're going to review the effect of some drugs by class, not specific names of drugs, but by classes. All right, so a cholinergic drug or cholinergic agonist, then can decrease heart rate by some of these effects. They do both, all right? A cholinergic blocker, yes,
Would you mind spelling cholinergic?
sure.
Thank you.
So that refers to acetylcholine, okay? A cholinergic agonist and a cholinergic blocker are going to have opposite effects. A cholinergic agonist may not bind to acetylcholine's receptor, but it may, through some other mechanism, open a potassium channel. So it's going to end up having a similar effect. Okay? A cholinergic blocker is going to keep acetylcholine from binding to its receptor. So it's going to keep all of these events from happening and either keep the heart rate normal or allow the sympathetic nervous system to have an effect and speed up the heart rate. But that's one of the things I want to review with you tomorrow. So that's the parasympathetic component of regulating heart rate by decreasing heart rate. So let's say your heart rate is already high, you had a scare, so you stop the sympathetic, parasympathetic will be activated to bring this back to normal. Okay? So now let's say we're already at normal, and the sympathetic effect is going to be to increase the heart rate. It does the opposite as acetylcholine. It binds to beta-1 receptors on the SA node and the AB node. It also is going to affect stroke volume because it does have receptors on the contractile cells in the ventricle. Okay? But we'll talk about that when we talk about stroke volume. So it's going to also bind to funny channels and to transient calcium channels, but it doesn't affect potassium. Norepinephrine or epinephrine is going to function to activate, it's a G protein as well. It's going to activate adenylyl cyclase, which is going to form more cyclic AMP. That cyclic AMP is going to bind to funny channels, and it's going to bind to transient calcium channels, and both of them are going to allow positive ions into the cell. Funny channels will allow sodium into the cell. This will allow calcium into the cell. Okay, so that's what you're seeing here. And so if our normal pattern again is for depolarization to start there. The effect with norepinephrine is to start earlier. And with the transient channels open as well, to have a steeper gradient. So it takes less time to get to the threshold. For the opposite reasons of what was happening with acetylcholine. Now I have this graph here that shows how sympathetic increases the number of beats per minute, parasympathetic slows it down. But I have one problem with that graph. It's inaccurate. it correctly shows the change in gradient. All right? Due to the potassium efflux and the calcium influx is inaccurate because it shows that depolarization starting at the same voltage as it does for normal. So for sympathetic, it should be starting at about -40. For parasympathetic, about -70. Okay, or well, it's the range, -50 to -70. You don't have to know those numbers, but know that it occurs more negative or less negative if we're talking about parasympathetic versus sympathetic. No, these are new. I'll put these up on D2L. These were ones I modified last night. I was trying to combine the cardiac output with the blood pressure slides. All right, so there are some hormone effects. I didn't quite finish these slides. I had a headache when I got home yesterday and had to drive my daughter to Lodi and set my alarm to wake up at 4. And anyway, woke up at 2 there still with my headache and changed my alarm and decided you guys aren't worth it. Anyway, so we'll do without the fancy slides that we have some of them, but. So thyroid hormone increases heart rate. Typically in the past, I've just said thyroid hormone increases metabolic rate. You need more oxygen because you're making more ATP. A drive for oxygen increases heart rate via sympathetic nervous system. And while that's true, and you don't have to know these specific effects, remember the thyroid hormone is lipid soluble? Even though it's not a lipid, it crosses the plasma membrane. And so it, like steroids, will actually change the genetic activity. It will cause genes to be expressed and new proteins to be made.